The wine hit Trevon Ashby's chest like a verdict. Deep red bloomed across his plain gray suit, while 200 guests lifted their phones, laughing at the black man they'd mistaken for hired help. Grant Kessler smirked, certain he'd put a stranger in his place. But across the ballroom, a quiet assistant tightened his grip on his phone, and one silver-haired woman near the bar frowned, as if half recognizing a face she couldn't yet name. Nobody in that glittering room understood tonight the cost of a single glass would be an entire empire. An hour before the wine, Trevon Ashby was on his knees on his living room floor, trying to convince a 6-year-old that a bedtime story could wait until morning. "One more chapter," Nia said, holding the book against her chest like a treasure she refused to surrender. "The dragon didn't even say sorry yet. The dragon will still be there tomorrow," Trevon told her, working the small knot of his tie loose and then tying it again straighter. "Dragons are very patient. That's their whole thing." She studied him the way children study adults when they suspect they're being managed. "You look fancy." "I look like a man going to a boring party." "Then why go?" It was a fair question, and he didn't have a fair answer for a 6-year-old, so he gave her the honest shape of one instead. "Because sometimes you have to see how people act before you decide to trust them. You can learn a lot about a person by the way they treat someone who can't do anything for them." Nia considered this with the seriousness she reserved for things she didn't fully understand, but planned to remember. Then she extracted her real terms. "Home by when?" "Early, I promise." He kissed the top of her head, breathed in the smell of her shampoo, and handed her off to the sitter with the reluctance of a man who had learned the hard way that these ordinary nights were the ones that mattered. Whatever waited for him across town, none of it was as important as the girl already negotiating for a second story. The car that carried him toward Novacore Dynamics moved through the city without hurry. Marcus rode in the front seat, phone in hand, running through the evening the way he ran through everything, which was thoroughly and without drama. He had been Trevon's assistant long enough to know that his employer's calm was not the absence of intensity, but the discipline of it. "They still have no idea what you look like," Marcus said, glancing back. "Every call, every document, it all went through the lawyers. As far as Novacore knows, the principle behind Meridian is a signature and a wire transfer." "Good," Trevon said. "Let's keep it that way tonight." This was the part that people outside his world never quite believed. A man could build a firm that moved $1 billion and still walk through a crowded room without a single head turning, provided he wanted it that way. Trevon had wanted it that way for years. He had never given an interview, never let a photographer near him, never allowed his name to become a face. In the circles that mattered, Meridian Capital was spoken of with a kind of nervous respect, and its owner was a rumor with a checkbook. The invisibility was not shyness, it was leverage. A man no one recognized could see the truth of things before the truth learned to perform for him. Tonight was the last piece of that truth. His people had spent weeks doing what Meridian always did before a deal of this size, turning Novacore inside out, reading its books the way a doctor reads an X-ray. The numbers told one story, but numbers had never been enough for Trevon. Before he signed anything, he liked to see how a company behaved when it thought no one important was watching. So he had come to the party as no one important, the final stage of due diligence, and it did not happen in a conference room. It happened at a bar in a hallway, in the small cruelties that people permitted themselves when they believed there would be no bill. Novacore's ballroom was exactly what $1 billion was supposed to buy. Chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks. Waiters threaded through the crowd with trays of things that cost more than they were worth. And at the center of it all stood Grant Kessler, chief executive of Novacore, holding court with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted he belonged at the center. His wife moved through the same orbit on her own power. Peyton Kessler had the kind of polish that took work to look effortless, and she read the room like a woman who had spent her whole life learning where the cameras were. She laughed at the right jokes, touched the right forearms, and let her attention slide off anyone who couldn't be useful to her. Watching her, Trevon understood something before a single insult had been spoken. Grant's arrogance was loud, Peyton's was quiet, and quiet was more dangerous. He didn't get far into the room. A security guard stepped into his path with the bored authority of a man who had decided in half a second that this particular guest didn't fit. His eyes moved over the plain gray suit with no designer label over the face that no one had told him to expect and landed somewhere between suspicion and contempt. "Staff entrance is around back," the guard said. "I'm a guest," Trevon answered evenly. The guard didn't move. Around them, other guests performed the small choreography of avoidance, angling their shoulders, letting their gazes skate past him as though not seeing a problem was the same as not having one. He had been in enough rooms to recognize the temperature of this one. It had already decided what he was. Grant noticed the way a shark notices motion. He crossed the floor with Peyton a half step behind, and his smile was the smile of a man about to be generous with someone else's dignity. "Is there a problem?" Grant asked, though his tone made clear he already knew the answer he wanted. "No problem," Trevon said. "I was invited. Were you?" It wasn't a question. Grant's gaze did the same inventory the guards had done: the suit, the skin, the absence of anything that announced money, and reached the same verdict. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like someone wandered in from the kitchen." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearest cluster of guests. Peyton didn't laugh. She watched which was worse. "Tell you what," Grant went on, warming to his own performance now that he had an audience. He plucked an empty glass off a passing tray and held it out. "Since you're here, make yourself useful. There's a woman by the window who's been waiting on a refill." The room waited. This was the moment a man was supposed to flush, stammer, explain himself, or leave. Trevon did none of it. He looked at the glass and then at Grant and let the silence stretch long enough that Grant's smile began to strain at the edges. Because the thing Grant had mistaken for humiliation was in fact an evaluation. Trevon was watching a chief executive reveal exactly who he was to a stranger he believed powerless, and he was scoring it. That refusal to break that unbothered stillness was the thing Grant couldn't stand. "I said," Grant repeated, quieter now, the cruelty sharpening, "make yourself useful." When Trevon still didn't take the glass, Grant reached to the tray again, lifted a full glass of red, and with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his life faced a consequence, poured it down the front of Trevon's chest. The cold came first, then the spreading warmth of the stain, then the smell of it rising into his face. Someone gasped. More than someone laughed. The phones came up all at once, a small forest of glowing rectangles, and the light in that beautiful room turned every lens toward a single humiliation. "Now you look like what you are," Grant said. Trevon stood in the center of 200 stares and did not raise his voice. He took the pocket square from his jacket and pressed it once against his chest, not to clean the stain, which was beyond cleaning, but to give his hands something deliberate to do, while the room finished showing him its true face. The wine soaked through to his skin. He let it. Then he turned, not away from Grant in retreat, but the way a man turns from a thing he has finished examining, and walked toward the doors. He took out his phone as he went. Marcus answered before the first ring finished. "Stop the diligence," Trevon said, his voice low and completely steady. "We're not signing. Freeze every disbursement channel tonight." "Understood," Marcus said. Nothing else. That was why he'd lasted. Trevon crossed the length of the ballroom in that unhurried walk, and the crowd parted for the wet, disgraced stranger with an eagerness that curdled into something else, as certain guests began quietly to wonder why he wasn't afraid. Near the bar, the silver-haired woman set down her drink. Diane Reyes had chaired the board of Meridian's operating company for 3 years, and she had never met the man who owned the trust above her, but she had spent a career reading rooms, and something in the way this stranger moved, unhurried, unbroken, entirely unimpressed by a man worth hundreds of millions, snagged in her mind like a name on the tip of a tongue. Her frown deepened. She didn't have it yet, but she was close, and she knew the feeling of being close. Trevon walked out of the light and into the dark of the parking structure, and the doors swept shut behind him on 200 people who believed they had just watched a nobody get what he deserved. Here is the thing worth sitting with before the consequences arrive. A room that expensive, filled with people that accomplished, and the fastest verdict any of them could reach was delivered by the color of a man's skin and the label missing from his suit. They looked at Trevon Ashby and could not see past the surface to the person, because the surface was all they had ever needed to render judgment. And his silence, which they mistook for weakness, was nothing of the kind. It was the silence of a man who held every card and had simply decided not to show them yet. The cruelty in that ballroom did not expose Trevon. It exposed the people committing it. When the powerful reveal that they measure a human being by his race and his clothes, they are not describing him. They are describing the poverty at the center of themselves, the kind no chandelier can light. He didn't need to defend his dignity in that room because dignity was never the thing at risk. Theirs was. The car pulled up. Trevon got in the wine cold against his shirt now and looked out at the tower blazing with light behind him. Somewhere up there, Grant Kessler was already retelling the story, making himself the hero of it. Somewhere up there, a deal worth $1 billion had just quietly died, and only 2 people in the building knew it yet. Marcus glanced at the stain, then at his face, and asked the only question that mattered. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Trevon said. And he was in the way that mattered. The suit could be replaced. What he'd learned tonight could not be unlearned, and it had saved him from putting his name beside people who would have poisoned everything they touched. He thought of Nia asleep by now, the dragon still waiting in her book to say it was sorry. He thought of the answer he'd given her a few hours earlier, the one he hadn't known would be tested so quickly. You can learn a lot about a person by the way they treat someone who can't do anything for them. He had gone to that party to find out who the Kesslers were. They had told him completely in the space of a single glass. The car pulled into the street and the tower shrank in the mirror behind him. There's an old idea that a suit doesn't make the man and everyone nods at it because it's easy to nod at. But the truer, harder version is this. The way a person treats someone they believe is beneath them is not a small thing, not a bad night, not a moment to be edited out later. It is the most honest portrait they will ever sit for. Grant Kessler had just painted his in front of 200 witnesses and 100 cameras, and he had signed it with his own hand. He simply didn't know yet that anyone important had been looking. The call reached Grant Kessler at 9 the next morning, and it did not go the way he expected. He had come into the office still riding the warmth of the night before still half laughing about the man in the ruined suit when his chief financial officer knocked once and delivered the news with a face the color of paper. Meridian had frozen. Not slowed, not renegotiated. Frozen. Every channel that was supposed to move the first tranche of $1 billion had gone dark overnight, and the lawyers on the other end were returning calls with a single sentence and nothing behind it. The principal had withdrawn from diligence. No reason given, no opening left to argue through. A lesser man might have panicked. Grant did something that in its own way was more impressive and more damning. He got interested, because Grant Kessler had not built Novacore by flinching. He'd built it by understanding faster than the people around him that a story was worth more than a fact, and that the person who controlled the telling controlled the outcome. Somewhere between his office door and his desk, he stopped seeing a catastrophe and started seeing a problem, and problems Grant believed were just narratives that hadn't been rewritten yet. He watched the video himself first. Someone had already posted it, of course, the whole ugly length of it, the glass, the stain, the laughter. And where a decent man would have seen his own reflection, Grant saw raw material. "Cut it," he told his communications director, a sharp young man named Devin, who had learned to stop asking why. "I want the front half gone. Start it where he's already wet. Start it where he turns and walks at me. A big man walking at the host in his own event. You see a threat? You see security doing its job." Devin frowned at the screen. People saw the original. People saw a phone video at a party after 3 drinks, Grant said. By tonight, they'll have seen our version 6 times. Repetition is truth, Devon. Whoever says it last says it loudest. He was already turning away, already composing the next move. Get it to the friendly outlets. Frame it as an incident. A disruptive guest removed. If anyone uses the word race, it's the disruptor who made it about race, not us. By noon, it was everywhere. Not the original, the edited one clipped to begin at the exact second that erased the provocation and left only a large black man in a wine-dark shirt striding toward the camera while a host recoiled. The headline on the first outlet to run it called him a harasser. The second called him unstable. The comment sections did what comment sections do, and the lie put on its shoes while the truth was still deciding whether to get out of bed. Trevon watched it in his study that evening with Marcus standing by the window. He didn't speak for a long moment, and it wasn't fear that held him. It was recalculation. He had gone to that party expecting a man who was cruel. He had not expected a man who was fast. Grant had taken a video that should have ended him, and in the space of a single morning turned it into a weapon pointed the other way. That was not the work of a fool. That was the work of someone genuinely dangerous, and Trevon revised his estimate of the fight accordingly. He's good, Trevon said, and it was not a compliment. It was a threat assessment. He's lying, Marcus said. The two aren't mutually exclusive. That's what makes him a problem. The next blow did not come from Grant at all. It came from a conference room Trevon should have owned outright, and that was the part almost no one understood about the shape of his power. Meridian's operating company answered to a board, and the board was chaired by Diane Reyes. This was the architecture Trevon had built on purpose years ago, and it had 2 floors that most people never saw. On the top floor sat ownership. Trevon held roughly 70% of the voting control, not in his own name, but through a holding entity called Ashby Trust, a structure so quiet that even the directors who ran the company day to day had never connected the invisible principle of Meridian to the man himself. On the floor below sat Operation the Board, the executives, the machinery that ran the firm's public life. Diane and her directors governed that lower floor. They had real authority over how the company behaved, over its executives, over its deals in progress. What they did not have, what they could not touch, was the ownership above them. They ran the house. They did not hold the deed. For years, that separation had cost Trevon nothing. Now it was about to cost him something, and he had known walking out of that ballroom that it might. The board convened an emergency session because from where they sat, a disaster was unfolding with no explanation. Their principal had killed a $1 billion agreement overnight without consulting them, and within hours, the counterparty's version of events had painted their firm as the aggressor in a racial incident going viral by the hour. Diane sat at the head of the table and listened to directors talk themselves into fear. "We can't defend a decision we don't understand," one of them said. "He froze a signature deal over a personal altercation at a party. That's what it looks like from here, and from where the market sits, it looks worse." Diane had her own suspicion sharpening now into something with edges. The stranger in the ballroom, the unhurried walk, the face she'd almost placed. She was beginning to understand who she had watched get a glass of wine thrown at him, and the understanding turned her stomach. But suspicion was not proof, and she chaired a board that answered to fiduciary duty, not to her instincts. The vote she called was narrow, and it was ugly. Pending review, the board would suspend Trevon's operating role, distance the firm publicly from the frozen deal, and open its own inquiry. It was the lower floor protecting the house from a fire it didn't understand, and it was in its own logic defensible. It just happened to be aimed at the one man who could have explained everything in a sentence. Because here was the choice that mattered, the one that separated Trevon from the men fighting him. He could have ended it that afternoon. He could have walked into that conference room, laid the Ashby Trust documents on the table, revealed the 70%, and dissolved the board's authority over him with a single reveal. The card was in his hand the entire time. He chose not to play it. He chose not to play it because a man who reveals his strongest card the moment he's pressured has learned nothing about his enemy, and Grant Kessler was still busy revealing himself. Peyton had not yet fully shown her hand. The fraud that Trevon's people had already documented had not yet been made to matter. If he flipped the trust now, he'd win the room and lose the war because the Kesslers would scatter launder and vanish behind their lawyers while the public still believed their edited video. So he let the board suspend a title. He let them freeze a roll. He kept the deed in the dark, and he waited, which is a very different thing from being helpless, though from the outside they can look identical. Grant called him that night. Trevon almost didn't answer and then did precisely because a man learns the most from an enemy who thinks he's winning. "You could have just taken the glass," Grant said, and there was something loose and pleased in his voice, the sound of a man who believed the board's decision had already been reported to him. "You made this hard on yourself. I want you to understand this doesn't have to keep going. Call your lawyers off. Let the deal breathe again. And all of this." The word covered the video, the headlines. The suspension, all of this goes quiet. "And if it doesn't go quiet," Trevon asked, "then it gets loud in ways you won't like." Grant's tone cooled by a precise degree, the negotiator letting the threat show through the charm. "I do my homework too. Single father, custody of a little girl. It would be a shame if the story that's out there right now, unstable, aggressive, unfit, followed a man into a courtroom where they decide who's fit to raise a child. Reputations have consequences. I'd hate for yours to reach her." Something in Trevon went very still and very cold, and it was not fear. It was the specific clarifying anger of a father who has just heard his child used as leverage. He had absorbed the wine without flinching. He had watched them take his name and paint it black, and had waited with the patience of a man who trusted his own cards. But this was a different floor of him entirely, one that had nothing to do with Meridian, or trusts, or votes. "Say her name again," Trevon said so quietly it barely crossed the line, "and understand that everything after that is your choice, not mine." He hung up before Grant could answer because some threats don't deserve the dignity of a reply, and because he did not trust what he would say next. Peyton's contribution arrived 2 days later, and it was in its cold craftsmanship the most alarming thing yet. Grant fought loud. Peyton fought clean, and clean was harder to see coming. She had understood something her husband, for all his speed, had missed. The video's real danger wasn't that it showed cruelty. It was that it showed racial cruelty, and that was the charge that could bury Novacore no matter how the front half was edited. So she went to work on the one element the edit couldn't fully erase, and she did it with money and patience and an eye for exactly which human being could be bought. She found a young black man who had worked catering that night, a server with debts and a sick mother, and every reason to need what she was offering, and she paid him generously to step forward with a new story. In this version, the confrontation in the ballroom had not been a rich white host degrading a black guest. It had been a dispute between two members of the working staff, a spilled drink, a heated argument, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by outsiders eager to make it about race. She dressed it in the language of nuance. She held a small, tasteful event for a workplace equity foundation the following week and let the cameras find her being gracious. She gave interviews in which she sounded wounded that anyone would weaponize race so cynically. And it worked in the way these things work, which is not by convincing everyone, but by giving the undecided a comfortable place to rest. The story got complicated. Complicated stories don't trend. Novacore's stock, which had wobbled, steadied, and then climbed. The Kesslers moved through their week, reassembling their reputation brick by brick, and Trevon watched a lie get laundered into legitimacy by two people who were, he now fully understood, every bit as capable as they were cruel. The cost of all of it came home to him in the smallest voice in his house. Nia found him in the kitchen one evening, standing over a tablet he'd forgotten to turn face down, and she'd seen enough of the screen to be confused by it. "Daddy, why are the people on TV saying bad things about you?" He turned the tablet over too late and crouched down to her level because there are conversations you cannot have standing up. "Some people," he said carefully, are telling a story that isn't true. They're telling it because the true story would get them in trouble and they'd rather I look bad than tell it. Her small face worked through this. Can't you just tell everybody what really happened? I can. And I will. But sometimes you have to wait for the right moment so that when you tell the truth, people are actually ready to hear it. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. If you say the true thing too early, the people who are lying just tell a bigger lie. You have to let them run out of lies first. That sounds hard, Nia said. It's the hardest part, he agreed. But I'd rather do the hard part right than the easy part wrong. Do you trust me? She thought about it with her whole body the way she thought about everything. Yeah, she decided, but you should still tell them soon. He almost laughed, and the almost laugh was the first thing that had loosened in his chest in days. Soon, he promised. I'm getting everything ready. The final blow of the act was designed to make sure soon never came. Novacore's lawyers produced a document, and the document was a lie so well constructed, it took Trevon's own people a full day to prove it was one. It purported to show that Trevon had approached the Kesslers before the party, that he had threatened to kill the deal unless they paid him privately, and that the frozen disbursements were not the act of a principled investor walking away from a rotten partner, but the tantrum of a man running an extortion scheme that hadn't paid off. Manufactured emails, a fabricated timeline. Enough surface plausibility to give the board exactly what a frightened board wants: a reason to stop asking hard questions. Diane called the vote she'd been dreading. With the extortion claim on the table, the board moved from suspending Trevon's role to formalizing it, distancing the firm entirely pending what they now framed as a serious legal matter. On paper, in the eyes of the operating company he had built, Trevon Ashby was no longer a principled owner temporarily set aside. He was an alleged criminal held at arm's length by his own institution. That night, the house was dark and quiet in the way houses get when a day has taken everything it came for. Trevon stood in the doorway of Nia's room and watched her sleep, one arm thrown over the dragon book, her breathing slow and untroubled by any of it. On paper at that moment, he had lost nearly everything a man could be said to have. His name was a slur running across 100 screens. His firm had turned its back. The people who had humiliated him were richer and cleaner than they'd been the week before. And this is the thing worth stopping on in the dark before the story turns. It would be easy to call this the moment Trevon lost, and by every visible measure it was. But watching a man stand in a doorway watching his daughter sleep, you understand that the measures were never the point. Everything the Kesslers had taken from him was the kind of thing that can be taken: reputation, position, the good opinion of frightened men. Money buys the microphone, and it can buy the story that comes out of it, and for a week it had bought both. What it cannot buy, what it has never once managed to buy, is the quiet of a man who knows he did the right thing and the trust of a child who believes him without needing to see the proof. Trevon had not lost the two things that mattered. He still held the truth gathered and documented and waiting, and he still had her. Standing in that doorway, a man who had been stripped of everything the world could see was in the only account that would end up mattering, still completely solvent. He was not at the bottom because he had been beaten. He was at the bottom because he had chosen to let his enemies climb all the way up before he pulled the floor out from under them. And there is a world of difference between the two, even when they wear the same face. He closed her door softly and went to find his phone. There was a call to make, and for the first time in a week, he was ready to make it. The waiting was almost over. The Kesslers had shown him everything now: the speed, the polish, the willingness to reach for his child. They had run very nearly all the way out of lies. What none of them had accounted for, not Grant with his edited video, not Peyton with her bought confession, not a board that had voted in good faith on manufactured evidence, was that the man they had suspended from a title still owned the ground the entire company stood on. And a suspension, however official, however cleanly documented, only works on a man who can actually be removed. Trevon dialed. Marcus answered on the first ring the way he always did. "It's time," Trevon said. "Pull everything. The original video, the full file, all of it. And set the meeting. There was the briefest silence on the line, the sound of a man who had waited a week for these exact words. The board meeting. The signing, Trevon said. Tell Novacore the principal of Meridian wants to meet them in person to discuss the future of the deal. Tell them he's finally ready to show his face. The trials of that week had not been sent to break him. They had been sent, though the Kesslers would never have used the word, to sort out who in this story was actually strong and who had only ever been loud. And a man who keeps his faith and his decency in the dark when both would be so much easier to abandon is not being tested for weakness. He is being confirmed for something else entirely, and the confirmation was about to arrive with the force of a door swinging open. Novacore had until the end of the week. Their lawyers were already moving the company's assets toward another fund, quietly, the way people move furniture out of a house they intend to burn. Once the transfer closed, the frozen billion would find a new home, the trail would go cold, and whatever Trevon had gathered would become the complaint of a disgraced man against a company that had already changed shape. Grant knew this. It was why he'd accepted the meeting so readily when Marcus's message came through the principal of Meridian, ready at last to show his face, ready to talk about the future of the deal. Grant read it as surrender. A frightened owner suspended by his own board crawling to the table to salvage something. He arrived at Meridian's offices with Peyton beside him and the loose confidence of a man who had already won and was only here to collect. They were shown into a boardroom where the directors of the operating company were assembled. Diane Reyes at the head of the table, the same board that had suspended Trevon on the strength of a lie. Grant took this as staging for his benefit. He straightened his cuffs. He prepared to be gracious in victory. The door at the far end of the room opened. The man who walked in wore a suit that fit him well, and he moved with the same unhurried certainty he'd carried across a ballroom floor a week earlier, except now there was no wine on his chest and no crowd to perform for. He crossed to the head of the table, and Diane rose to give him the chair, and it was in that small gesture, the chair of the board yielding her seat, that Grant's face began to change. Recognition arrived in stages, and each one cost him something. First, the general sense of a face he'd seen, then the specific memory of where, then the full floor-dropping comprehension of what it meant that this man, this exact man, was walking to the head of Meridian's table while the chair of its board stepped aside for him. The color went out of Grant's face the way it had gone out of his CFO's a week before. Beside him, Peyton went very still, her composure holding for one more second than her husband's before it too began to crack at the edges. Trevon sat. He did not gloat. He set a single folder on the table and rested one hand on it. "We've met," he said. "Though I don't think either of you caught my name that night. You were busy." Grant tried to speak and found the beginning of several sentences without reaching the middle of any. There's been no misunderstanding." Trevon opened the folder and turned the first document to face them, sliding it down the table with 2 fingers. It was the ownership record of Ashby Trust laid out in the plain language of percentages. 70% of the voting control of this company sits in that trust. The trust is mine. It has been mine since before you'd ever heard the name Meridian. He let them read it, let the numbers do the work that no raised voice could have done. Your people spent this last week working very hard to have me suspended, and it worked. They suspended a title. He looked at Diane, then not unkindly, and back at the 2 people across the table. "No one," he said, "gets to suspend the man who owns the building." The room understood before the Kesslers did. Diane sat down slowly, and the expression on her face was the particular hollowness of someone realizing the precise dimensions of a mistake. She had chaired a board that voted twice in good faith on evidence a man across this table had manufactured, and she had aimed both votes at the one person in the story who had done nothing wrong. She would have that to sit with. But that reckoning was hers, and it came later. What came now was the truth, all of it released at once. Trevon had chosen not to spill a single fact of it for a week, and this was the reason. He had let the Kesslers edit and buy and forge and threaten because a man who empties his evidence too early only teaches his enemy which holes to fill. Now there were no holes left to fill. Now they had committed publicly and permanently to every lie, and the truth landed on all of them at the same time. The original video went out first, uncut, the full length of it beginning where Grant's edit had carefully cut away. Not a large man striding at a frightened host, but a chief executive lifting a glass of red wine and pouring it down the chest of a stranger he'd decided to humiliate to teach him in Grant's own recorded words what he was. 200 phones had captured it from 200 angles, and Meridian released them all so there could be no argument about editing no second version to muddy the first. The thing the Kesslers had spent a fortune complicating became in an afternoon uncomplicatable. Then came the rest of the folder, and the rest was worse for them than any video, because Meridian did not investigate companies casually, and the file Trevon's people had built during those weeks of diligence had never been only about wine at a party. It documented the thing the party had merely confirmed, that Novacore's books were a work of fiction, that the company had moved money. It did not have hidden losses, it could not cover, and paid in cash and favors for the silence and cooperation of people who should have said no. The fabricated extortion emails the Kesslers had produced were dismantled line by line against records that proved where Trevon had actually been and what he had actually said. The bought confession came apart the moment the server's payment was traced back to an account that led through two thin shells to Peyton herself. The public that had been given a comfortable, complicated place to rest its judgment now had nowhere comfortable left to sit. The complication had been the lie, and the lie was gone. What remained was simple, and simple is what moves. The outrage that Peyton had so carefully diffused reassembled itself into something no foundation gala could soften, aimed now at its rightful target. A wealthy couple who had humiliated a single father invented a crime to bury him and paid a struggling man to lie about his own dignity. Diane came to him before the day was over. She did not offer excuses, which was the only thing that made her apology worth hearing. "I read a document and I believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative," she said. "I looked at a man in a ruined suit on a screen and I let a story tell me who he was. That was the whole job and I got it exactly wrong." She met his eyes. "I judged you by the surface, same as they did. I just told myself it was diligence." "You did," Trevon agreed. "He didn't soften it for her and he didn't sharpen it either. The difference is you're saying so, that's not nothing." Novacore came apart quickly after that, the way things do once the story holding them up is pulled. The asset transfer collapsed when the receiving fund read the room and ran. Regulators who had been content to let a viral video stay a viral video found they could not ignore a documented fraud. The partners who had steadied the stock scattered. The $1 billion did not change hands so much as evaporate, taking with it the company that had been built to chase it. By the time the criminal filings were unsealed, Grant and Peyton Kessler were not the toast of anything. They were defendants standing at the edge of a ruin they had spent a week insisting belonged to someone else. The morning after they came to his door, Trevon lived in a house that would have surprised the 200 people from the ballroom, an ordinary house on an ordinary street, the home of a man who had never needed his address to announce anything about him. He was in the front hall, crouched down, zipping Nia's backpack and checking that she had the dragon book she'd insisted on bringing for show and tell when the knock came. He opened the door to two people he barely recognized. A week had done to the Kesslers what years do to other people. Grant's confidence was gone so completely that its absence was the first thing you noticed. Peyton's polish had cracked all the way through. They stood on his step with the ruined faces of people who had run out of stories, and when Grant's legs gave, it was not quite a decision to kneel so much as a failure to keep standing. "Please," Grant said, and the word came out of him with nothing behind it but need. "We'll lose everything. The company, the everything. You can stop it. One call and you can stop it. Please." Peyton was crying or doing the thing that grief does when pride is still fighting it. We made mistakes. We know. Whatever you want. Whatever it takes. Trevon stood in his doorway with his daughter's small hand finding his, and he looked at the two people kneeling on his step, and there was no triumph in his face. There was something quieter and more final than triumph. You believed, he said, that there was no bill for treating a person the way you treated me. That you could look at someone, decide he was nothing, and pour a glass of wine down his chest in front of 200 people, and that the world would simply let you. He shook his head slowly. You weren't wrong that there's a price. You were only wrong about when it comes due. You're not being punished right now. You're just seeing the invoice. He did not raise his voice and he did not draw it out. He had watched cruelty perform for an entire week. He had no interest in performing back. I'm walking my daughter to school, he said. I'd ask you to be gone from my step by the time we're down the block. He closed the door. Not a slam, which would have given them the satisfaction of his anger, but a quiet, complete closing, the sound of a chapter ending on a set of people who had assumed the story was theirs. Nia looked up at him as they came down the front steps into the ordinary morning, the two figures behind them already rising, already turning away, already smaller. Who were they, Daddy? He considered how to answer a 6-year-old on the subject of people like the Kesslers, and he found, walking into the clean light with her hand in his, that the truest answer was also the simplest. People who forgot something important, he said. That you're supposed to be kind to everybody, not just the people who can do something for you, especially the people who can't. Did they learn it? Maybe, he said. It's a hard way to learn it. There are easier ways. Like what? Like just deciding to be kind in the first place, he said, before anybody makes you. She seemed satisfied with that in the way she was satisfied with most things once she'd turned them over and found they held together. She swung his hand a little as they walked, the dragon book tucked under her other arm, and behind them the two people who had once stood at the center of a room full of laughter finished getting to their feet on an empty street and went away. There's a comfortable belief that the powerful are untouchable, that the height they've climbed to is permanent, that people at the top of a room get to decide who counts and never answer for it. It's a belief that lasts right up until the moment it doesn't. The world turns out to be smaller than the arrogant imagine, and fairer and far better at keeping accounts. Cause circles back to meet effect on a street you didn't expect at an hour you didn't choose. The summit of today is only the edge of tomorrow's fall for anyone who climbs it without carrying a little mercy along. Trevon Ashby had understood that all along, which was why he'd never needed to stand on anyone to feel tall. He walked his daughter to school in the ordinary morning, a single father in a plain suit holding a small hand, and he was by every measure that had ever actually counted the richest man for miles.